All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the story. Uh, this first dynamic I'd like to suggest to you is figuring out where your story begins and ends. You may have already done that, so maybe go backwards and say, how did I decide that? Why do I feel that it begins here? And how do I know that it ends here? Sometimes it's very clear. Often the marker is a new geographic territory, a new set of characters. Sometimes a theme shifts. Sometimes a conclusion is brought to the story, but other times you may really have a choice to make. So in this story, I begin it when Jesus returns from the other side, a change in setting. He meets Jairus, a new character in the story, and he follows him through, and the story ends when his engagement with Jairus ends. I could have told a very different story by telling just the story of the bleeding woman in the middle. That would have had a very different feel to it. So think about that. What is the story you're intending to tell? You can pause and jot down why you began and ended your story at the place you did. All right, a second characteristic, one that you've read about in Story Journey and in other reading you've done, are verbal threads or sonic echoes. These are words that are repeated over and over again. They often set the thematic for a section, and in the biblical passages, often a passage is defined by the vocabulary. You'll find this word gets repeated often, and in the next story it totally vanishes, but a new word will be repeated. So paying attention to those words will help you as a storyteller to internalize what's going on. In this passage that I shared with you, the number 12 is important. The woman is 12 years old, and the little girl is 12 years old, and the woman has been suffering with a flow of blood for 12 years. I notice a thread in that the woman and Jairus both fall down before Jesus, right? Setting up a parallel and a contrast. In the middle of the story, the woman moves forward with courageous trust or faith in the more common translations. And immediately Jesus turns to Jairus and says that he should have courageous trust, following the example of the woman. In his video, Tim talks about how each section of the Lazarus story has vocabulary of its own that distinguishes one of the 6 sections from another, and then there's threads that run through it like the word believe. So pause and note any sonic echoes that you've discovered in your story. The next piece is paying attention to the narrator. This is a tricky thing to do, but one way to be more clear on it is to realize that the narrator is also a character whom you embody. And you get a better feel for that when you're storytelling. In a written passage, the narrator is somebody who is invisible and you never see it. It has a very neutral effect to it. In a storytelling, the narrator becomes a witness to what has happened. It's a very different dynamic between print and oral telling, between reading and hearing a story. The narrator is not simply describing what happened. The narrator is crafting the story in such a way to move the audience in the direction they desire. So observe the parts that don't have quotation marks around them, and how is the narrator telling the story? How might the narrator have told it differently? I'll give you just one example from mine. Oh, maybe 2. The Jairus is identified several times as a leader of the synagogue. Why does the narrator make that choice? What is he doing with that? Another example is generally in the biblical material, you can check your story and see if this is true, the introduction of a character is often an adjective and maybe their gender. Right? It's a very quick thing that happens. In the introduction of the woman with the flow of blood, it's a very long introduction. And so why is the narrator doing that? It's as if the narrator is creating sympathy for this woman by explaining her ongoing plight. Her introduction is only matched, I believe, by that of John the Baptist, which is extensive, and you could hear that in the extra storytelling video that I offered you of my work on the baptism, and the story right before this, which has a man who was possessed by a demon, and there's an extensive description of his plight. So it's interesting that in the same section of Mark, you get both of those things. So pay attention to the narrator. What clues is the narrator giving you? So you can pause and make notes on your story about that. The fourth characteristic I'd like to talk about are relationships within the story as you have defined it. So what's the structure that's moving through it? Are there places where surprises happen or sudden twists and turns in the narrative? What is the movement of your particular story? So for example, I think it's really interesting that my story is structured with an episode about Jairus' plea, and then the story of the woman with the flow of blood, and then the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. So why that structure? What's going on there? My sense is often when one story is held within another, the two stories are making commentary on each other. In Tracy's video, she talked about how she portrays Jesus' energy as growing in his engagement with the tempter, and so that by the third episode, Jesus is getting his strength of the spirit that he had earlier in the narrative back, and he says, "It is said," right? She makes that point. So think about the structure and the surprises and twists of your story as you pause. You might notice that all the things that we're doing are the kinds of things you learn to do in many ways in your high school English or college English class, where you're thinking about character, setting, the narrator's voice. And setting is the fifth characteristic I want you to look at. Where does it take place? Why does that matter? How does that shape the content and the impact of the story? When does it take place? All those things. So this story takes place after a sea crossing. There's a really interesting book by a friend of mine named Elizabeth Malbin, where she plots all the places, the settings that take place in the Gospel of Mark. And she lays them out in order, kind of like this. And down the center of it is the sea. All sorts of amazing things happen on the sea and on both sides of the sea. It's a repeated place that comes up, a kind of a liminal place where things are at play. What does it matter that this story takes place in Jewish territory after they've returned from the place of Gentile territory where the pig herders were, and the demons chased them down into the water? We know we're back in Jewish territory because there's a house of a synagogue leader here. And so what difference does that make? And in one of the extra videos I gave you, Dennis Dewey mentions that his story is introduced that it was the Sabbath day, and that shapes that setting. The setting of the Sabbath shapes the way the whole story is to be heard. So you can pause, note where is the setting of your story. The sixth characteristic that I want to look at is emotional tone. What emotional energy do you choose to bring to your story? What clues in the passage as it's been given to you give you clues that that is the right emotional tone to take? So the ongoing story of this woman's plight sets up a feeling for me of desperation. And yet, she's not defined by her desperation. She's also courageous and moving forward. Sometimes my passage tells me very specifically what emotions are at play. And the woman, trembling and afraid, fell before him and told him the whole truth. I perceive, and this one is more my perception, that could be disputed, that the people come from the house of the synagogue leader, and when they look at Jesus in contact with this unclean woman, when they say teacher, it's with skepticism. That disposition of the people from Jairus' house is confirmed when they get there, and once again they taunt him. So that's my rationale. Others might have made a different choice with the passage. Tracy invites us in her reflection to say, well, you're a human being. How would you feel? How would you feel after 40 days without food? She invites you to bring that emotional energy into the story as you tell it. So why don't you pause and think about the emotions that are running through your story as you choose to portray it. The seventh point that we're coming to is where is its placement in the overall plot of the story you're dealing with. So if you're doing the whole book of Ruth, right, you might say, well, I'm telling it from beginning to end. It's not in the middle of a plot. Then maybe you might want to think of the grand divine drama that's taking place in the scripture, and where does it fall within that? Why was this story remembered after it had taken place in light of the larger story of Israel? In my story, this is part of the first 7 or so chapters where Jesus is in Galilee, he's teaching, he's gathering disciples, and he's healing, right? And we see a lot of that energy right here. As I stated earlier, it comes right after a sea crossing. Maybe that's important. Maybe that's something to pay attention to. So think about where your story is in the placement of the gospel. Different gospel writers move stories around. So if you're looking at gospel writers, right? So for example, the story of the cleansing of the temple ends Mark's gospel. It's in the last week of Jesus' life. In the Gospel of John, it's at the very beginning of the gospel. It's one of the first things he does. How does that placement take two stories that are on the surface very similar and change what they're about because of their role in the larger story? So you can pause and maybe think about where your story takes place in the larger narrative. Right, we're going to do one more element in this segment before I'll end this video. Very important. Who are the characters that are there? It's good to just sit down and make a list of them, or you might forget some. What are they doing? How do they speak? What do they say about themselves? What do others say about them? And how do you bring what you come to understand about the characters into your embodiment of them? So in my story, there's lots of characters. There's Jairus, there's Jesus, there's the crowd, there's the disciples, Peter, James, and John. There's the people that come from the house of the leader of the synagogue. There's professional mourners there. There's the little girl. There's the mom who appears towards the end. So just making a list of those and then thinking which ones are principal. And so for example, looking at the leader of the synagogue and just tracing through, what does he say? What does he do? How does he feel when the woman interrupts their trip to go and heal his daughter, right? And then looking at the woman, there's this, as I said, an extensive characterization of her. How will that part of the narrative that's given to me shape the way I portray her? Often I think people, because of our literary interpretation, this notion that the narrator is kind of invisible, we think, oh, there's the narrator's part, and that stops, and then there's the character's part. My sense is very different about what's going on. I think there's a crossfade space between the narrator and the character. And so if you watch my video again, you can see how I'm becoming the woman as I'm the narrator describing her. So by the time that she acts, she is already fully embodying the woman. I'm already fully embodying the woman. All right. So there's the narrator who's going to report what other people said moves towards becoming them, even if it's only and she said, right? Even if it's only a couple of words. So we're going to bring this third video to a close, and I invite you to write down your reflections, and if you want to go on, you can start the next video. Thank you.